I, which is the square root of a negative number, and we are also going to talk about complex numbers. So the imaginary unit defined is the square root of -1. That equals I. The imaginary unit I can be used to write the square root of any negative number. So we started determining values of x. We were trying to factor quadratic equations the past couple of days, and we looked at some examples, and we were asked to take the square root of a negative number, and that doesn't necessarily exist. So we're going to look at, if we factor out that negative, what it would be relatively close to. If R is a positive real number, the square root of -R is equal to the square root of -1 times the square root of R, which is I times the square root of R. For example, square root of -3 is equal to the square root of -1 times the square root of 3, which is equal to I times the square root of 3. Square root of -4 is equal to the square root of -1 times the square root of 4, which is equal to the square root of -1 is I, and the square root of 4 is 2. Proper notation is 2I. If I times the square root of R, the quantity is squared, then we have I squared times the square root of R squared, which gives us -1 times R, which simplifies to -R. An example of this would be I times the square root of 2 squared. We need to distribute the square to the I, so we have I squared, and then we have the square root of 2 squared. I squared is -1. The square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is the square root of 4, which is 2, which then gives us -2. Some examples. Square root of -25 is equal to the square root of -1 times the square root of 25. Square root of -1 is I. The square root of 25 is 5. We write this as 5I. (72), the square root of -72. Square root of -1 times the square root of 72.